In this lesson we're going to move on to our spring. A spring, when you look at it, is reasonably complicated, but for all intents and purposes is actually going to be an easy job in Rhino because it already has some tools set in place for making springs. All we're going to have to do is just decide how many loops are going to be in the spring, so we'll move on to that now. Just before we do that, I just want to tidy up the file a little bit, so I'm just going to turn off some of our layers. So we don't need the red layer right now, we don't need our purple, and this curve right here we can add to our curves layer. And in the previous lesson I drew this curve in, which was going to be the center of our spring, and when I drew it I actually snapped it to the middle of this rod, but it does mean that it's not in the center. By center I mean on the center line, which is where we want the spring to run. So this is really easy to fix. We're just going to go to the right view, we're going to go to transform and project to C plane. C plane being the current plane, so we're in the right view and our current plane is along this green line here, which is the y-axis. So going back to the right view, if you look at the prompt here, it's saying, do I want to delete the input object? So in this case, yes I do, because I don't want both lines, so I'm going to press yes. And if I'd pressed no, and by yes I mean I hit Y on the keyboard, if I'd pressed no, it'd still have a copy of the line over here as well. We don't need that. So we're going to start probably a little bit of trial and error to begin with to get the spring right. I'm going to keep this, and I think I'm actually going to hide everything else for now just so we can see what we're working on. So all I have selected now is this curve, and the way to do a spring is actually a command called helix. I'm going to type that in. If you want to find it, it's underneath this tab and it's over here, helix. So typed in helix, and if you read the instructions in the prompt line, it's the start of axis, so we're going to use the top of our, turning on our end snap, it's the top of our curve and the bottom of our curve. And if I now drag outside of it, you can see we've got basically a helix. Visually looking at that, we've got number of turns is 10, so we're looking up here in the prompt bar, you can see the number of turns is 10. So I'm actually going to try 10 to begin with. Actually, let's bump that up to 12. So I'm going to hit T on the keyboard, type 12, and you can see that increases. T again is probably not enough, I'll try 15. In fact, I may even try 20. And just looking at my sketch, our spring is around about this distance. So actually let me double click on the right view, so now we can see just the right view. Looking at our sketch, we actually need more turns than that, so T again. I'm going to go for 30 and may even try some more. So like I said, it's kind of trial and error till we get to where I want to be. Let's try that for now. So if we look in our perspective view, you can see in 2D there's only a 2D curve. If I hit shade, nothing happens. We now have a helix. So in order to make this into a 3D object, we're now going to pipe this helix. So pipe is over under our basically our primitives. It's over here. So you can have a pipe with a flat cap, which means the ends are flat, or you can have another pipe which has got round ends. We don't want the round ends, we're going to have flat ends. So it's now asking us to select the curve for the pipe. So I'm going to click on our helix, and you can see here it's now asking for diameter. I can do that with the mouse, or I can type it. If I type it, I have absolutely no idea how big I want it to be, so I'm going to visually do this here. If we're being strict about kind of making things in reality, we probably would want to have this as like a 1 millimeter, 1.5 millimeter diameter. So perhaps we should try that. I'll perhaps type that on the keyboard just to see what that looks like. Okay, that's 1.5, and it's also asking me for what I want at this end, so I'm going to type 1.5 again. Press enter, and it's now basically just waiting for us to press enter, and there we go. So that's now piped our spring. So 1.5 was probably too big because you can see they're kind of intersecting one another, or it may well be that my helix is too tight, so we need to just try another radius to start with. If this doesn't work, we'll have to redo our helix. As I said before, I don't mind making mistakes because it's actually quite a good way to learn from our mistakes. So again, we're going to do a pipe. It's in our primitives here. Pipe. Select our curve. This time I'm going to try 1 as the radius, and 1 again, and press enter. And let's have a look at what we have this time. Hopefully there's a bit of fresh air in between. There is. Okay, so that works for me. I imagine that'd be a pretty powerful spring, but we've basically done a spring. So I'm actually going to build just a couple more springs just to kind of repeat that, just so that it's 100% clear what's going on. So I'm happy with this one for our model. I'm just going to build a couple more just to kind of demonstrate the process again. So I'm going to move this curve over. I've copied it and pasted it, and I'm actually going to hide the one we want. And we're going to do helix again, so this time we'll use the tab. So we're going to hold down our control point curve, we drop over to this icon, helix, and we're asking for our end point or our start point and our end point. And I'm going to go to a different view because it's a bit tricky in perspective. So this is the number of turns, so we're going to hit T on the keyboard and we'll turn that down to 20. So you can see we've got less turns, and let's make this a bigger one, so our radius this time we'll say is 8. And if you see, if I still move my mouse, I can kind of change the orientation now of where the helix runs. It's not really important for this particular example, but in some circumstances you may want to change the way it runs. You can see in this top view I can kind of rotate around the circle and it will give me a different kind of screw direction, I guess. So pressing enter, and we're done. And again, if I wanted to make this into 3D, I'm going to go to our primitives here, go to a pipe, pick our curve, let's say a radius of 2 this time because it's a bigger helix, and there we go, there's another spring. So obviously the length of the line will determine how long the spring is, the number of turns will indicate the type of spring you've got, and then the thickness of your pipe also dictates what the spring looks like. So in this case we've got a spring for a lamp, so it's quite tightly coiled. If you're doing a spring for suspension, for example, you do a different number of turns, etc. So let's unhide what we have. Zoom extents. So now look in here, we have a spring. Now you can clearly see that our spring is actually too long. So I wanted it too long because I want to dictate where I'm going to cut this. So I'm going to cut the spring and I'm going to join it to this wire that we've done. So already it's looking like this part of the spring could be quite useful to split. So I'm going to hide everything else. And I'm actually going to do a pipe along this curve. So same command as before. And the only reason I'm doing a pipe right now is just reference because I want to see where it ends up. So actually we had our 2mm radius from before. I want a 1mm radius. So I'm deleting that, right clicking to repeat the command, 1 on the keyboard, and now we've got our hook. So this hook is going to join onto this spring. So what we really want to do here is I'm going to do a couple of cuts just to make life easier. So I'm going to go up here, and we want to get rid of most of this spring. So I'm kind of running my curve here along the axis of the coils. I'm going to split this. This may be wrong, I'm just kind of doing it by eye, so we'll see. I'm going to delete this piece. So I split our spring with our curve, so it's just split on the type split on the keyboard, and then it would ask for the cutting object, which is the curve. So I'm going to delete this piece because I don't want it, and I'm going to look, see what we have here. Okay, so that worked fairly well, and I now want to split just this top piece of the coil. So we really want to see if we can, if we drag this one down below the next loop, and I'm going to extrude it. So when I type extrude this time, you can see in the perspective view it's extruding along the, what plane are we in? Along the X axis. I don't want it in the X axis. I want it to be in the same axis as our spring itself. So I'm going to double click on the right view, and on the keyboard I'm going to press D for direction. So you can see up here we have another prompt. So D, and I'm going to end snap to our curve, and I'm going to drag in the direction I want it. So you can see now it's going to cut through our spring in the direction I want. I don't want this to extrude in both directions, so I'm going to press B on the keyboard. This is getting slightly complicated, but this is probably the most complicated part in our model. So now we'd like to get rid of this little piece here. I'm going to type split again on the keyboard, and I'm going to use our extrude, and I'm going to get rid of that. And we're also, see, I've cut a little bit too much there. It doesn't really matter. We can just join this together. And what I want to do is have a nice blend between these. So I'm going to do that next. I'm actually going to do that in the next lesson. So I'll finish off our little blend here, and I need to do the same at the bottom end as well. So next lesson we'll finish off this spring, and then we'll copy it and use the same spring for the upper arm as well.